Hey, hi, hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing my August reading wrap up and book hauls. At the end of every single month, I do what I call balancing the books, which I stole completely from Emma from Drinking by My Shelf, where I balance all of the books that I read this year, see how they affected my bingo board, and then see if I have enough bingos for all of the books I bought that month. This month, I genuinely loved reading. I fell in love with just the process of reading. Like, not all of the books I read were amazing or were good, but I just felt myself like craving to read. I just constantly wanted to have a book either in front of me or I was listening to one, and even if I wasn't enjoying the book, I was enjoying the process of reading, which is so great because if you follow along on my channel, you know that last month in July, I had the worst slump possibly of my life. Now, I read 10 books this month and I DNF put on pause 5 books. So I actually technically did worse than in the month of July where I read 12 books, but I don't care. If I can read the rest of my life like I did in this month, that's the goal. First things first, let's go through all of the books that I DNF'd or put on pause. First up, I DNF'd The Never Tilting World by Rin Chupeco. This is a library book, so I don't have to show you anymore, but this is the story of like a world that is not tilting anymore, and we're following both the night and day side, and we're following like these goddesses on both sides and then kind of these other two people who are interacting with them on both sides. The reason why I DNF'd it is it was just too slow for my taste and there were other things I needed to be getting to. I definitely think that I could have finished this book if I had had more time, but I wouldn't have rated it above a 3-star, so I didn't really see the point in me continuing when there were other things I needed to be reading and just wanted to get to those instead. Next, I put on pause Star Eater. So I didn't even mark where I'm at in this book because the publisher Recorded Media sent me the audiobook in exchange for a free review, so I've actually been listening to it. This is the story of is none the right word? I guess none is the right word. I don't totally know. This young girl who is part of this like religious order in this world, and they're basically going to send her off to be impregnated so that she can keep on the tradition, and she doesn't want to do that. And I made it like 10 or 15% through this book, and it kind of fell into the same category as The Never Tilting World. I wasn't super in love with it, so I needed to be getting to other things, so I put it on pause until future notice. But once again, I will be trying to finish this, and I think when I do finish it, it'll probably be like a 3-star. I did buy and listen to Little Heaven, but I only made it 50% through the book before I decided to DNF it. This is by Nick Carter, who also wrote The Troop and The Deep, which I loved both of those books by him, rated them 5 stars, which is why I wanted to check this one out. And it didn't do it for me. This is the story of these 3 unlikely mercenaries who are kind of forced together to go and rescue this boy who has been kidnapped by a religious cult and has to live out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. So I say kidnapped because his mother is in jail and his father is raising him, and his father has elected for the two of them to go live in this world. Kind of just has to live where his dad wants to live. So he's not really kidnapped, but he doesn't really want to be there, and his aunt wants to get him out. And then we're flipping between 2 timelines. We're flipping between that one and then years after the event, after they have saved him, when they are being called back to this world because something wasn't resolved. I made it 50%. I was really bored. I didn't like any of the characters, and I felt like Nick Cutter has a really gory, bloody, gruesome, gross writing style, and I love it, and I think it's really, really good for horror, but I felt like he was just kind of being gross for the sake of being gross, and it really wasn't like relating to the storyline, and it really wasn't relating to like the unsettling nature of the story, so I gave up on that one. Next, I started and DNF'd Spinning Silver. I also made it 50% into this one before I quit, and this is just because it was really slow and I couldn't get into the story, and it kept turning into things I wasn't expecting. I was really in love with like the first direction of the book, which is these 2 girls who have kind of taken over their family businesses, sort of. So this one girl has taken over the job of being a money collector for her father because he really is bad at his job and her family was dying, and someone that borrowed money from her, he couldn't pay back his debt, so basically his daughter is going to work for the money lender until the debt is paid off. And so you kind of learn about both of their stories and how they got there, and eventually a third POV is introduced, and she is kind of this rich man's daughter who is sold off in a political marriage. So they all end up relating to each other, but it's a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin where our main character can turn silver into gold and is taken away by these like fae-ish creatures, but I couldn't get into it, so I DNF'd at 50%. The last book that I technically didn't DNF in this month, I DNF'd it for my September month, is Foundry Side. This one was a really weird instance of, I really enjoyed the book, but I just wasn't into it. And my loan came out from my library, they wanted the book back, and I let them take it. And that's the second time that's happened, so I'm gonna be counting it as a DNF for realsies. I made it like 12% into the book. So it is this story of this world where there's like this magic where if you write on things with like these sigils, they can kind of be animated, and our main girl can hear what these animated objects are thinking. And then one day she steals this one object that seems to be way more powerful than anything she has ever come across before. These are the books that I read this month, minus some audiobooks. One of these was actually an audiobook, not a physical read. So first up, I read The House at the Bottom of the Lake for author Different Than Me. And this is the author, oh, what's his name? Josh Malerman. I'm pretty sure he's the guy that wrote Bird Box, if I'm correct, which I have not read. This is my first book that I've read by him, and I hated this book. Up until this morning, I was calling this book the worst book that I've ever read. But as of today, I've actually read one worse than it, but you'll hear about that next month in that wrap up. I rated this book 1 star. Let's talk about it really quickly. So this is a horror book, but it wasn't horrifying, and it's about these two teenage kids who go on their first date and they decide to go kayaking together. And while they're out on the lake, they find this like smaller lake, and then when they go out on that lake, they find a house at the bottom of the lake. And so they start being like drawn into and pulled into this house. So they learn how to like scuba dive, and they build a raft so that they can like sleep out on the lake and everything. And the way that the book ended was so unsatisfying, and it felt more like a love story between these two teenagers falling in love out on this house. There was this weird sex scene that I still to this day don't really think was necessary for the book. I was angry at it when I finished it, and I had wished that I hadn't read it. And that's the best thing I can say about that book. Next, for Bone on the Cover, I read Bone Gap, and this is by, I keep having to check my notes over here, Laura Ruby. So this is the story of this city called Bone Gap, Oregon, where people fall through the cracks and they keep disappearing. And one day this one girl named Rosa disappears from our main character's life, and he seems to be the only person who's still kind of investigating where she went, and he feels like no one else cares about her disappearance. And he is basically living his life the summer before he's about to go off to college, trying to figure things out, kind of coming of age, meeting a girl and like falling in love for the first time, and yet still searching for Rosa and not giving up on her. So this reminded me very, very much of I Crawl Through It by A.S. King, which I absolutely loved and rated 5 stars. You have this kind of like weirdness quality to it. You have this like idea of like testing, standardized testing being like a theme throughout the entire story, kids like being expected too much of them, and also this kind of like mysterious element in the background that's like constantly haunting our main characters. I really, really enjoyed it, and if you go watch the vlog where I actually read this book, I talk a little bit more about the details of some of the like mental disorders that are discussed in this story. And what's really, really interesting is, this is a slight spoiler if you don't want to know, skip ahead, our main character ends up realizing that he has face blindness, and I also have face blindness. So it was really cool to see someone with something that I have that I've never seen in literature before, and they handled it in a really, really good way. I ended up rating it 4.5 out of 5 stars because it just didn't quite do it for me the same way that I Crawl Through It did, but I really, really enjoyed this book, and it might just make it on my favorites of the year list. It kind of depends on how some of the others go. Next, I'm going to talk about these 2 books together because they are part of a series. I read Gild and Glint, both by Raven Kennedy, and I tabbed both of them, and I rated both of them 5 stars. So I read Gild for Buddy Reads this month, and then I read Glint for nothing. It didn't count towards the board. I think I'm gonna have to start having a stack of books that like didn't count towards the board, and if I get enough of those, then I'm allowed to like go buy a book. Like if I read 5 books that aren't on the board, I should be able to buy a book, like one book to equate for that, right? Loved both of these. These are a King Midas retelling. Raven Kennedy is not generally a fantasy romance author. She writes more romance directed books. She gave it a shot in these ones, and for me it was a home run. I totally don't think that the quality of these was like absolutely amazing beyond anything, but I enjoyed my read of these so much. I like couldn't put this book down. I read this in like 2 or 3 days, and then I read this in 2 or 3 days, and I'm actually currently reading the third book, so I'll be talking about that next month because I'm not far enough in it to like also include it into this story. So in this book we are following King Midas and this woman that he has taken prisoner, and he has turned her to gold, and she is just trapped in this palace in these cages inside of the palace, like room-sized cages. Really not much in the summary of the book, but King Midas land is kind of going to war, kind of starting to think about going to war with this neighboring land, and it brings in some heavy politics with the other nations, and it's a really, really dark book. There's a lot of trigger warnings for this book: domestic abuse, on-page rape and torture, death, and like gruesome death where people also mess with the body after the person has died. This one has less trigger warnings. This one is much more so our main character is still imprisoned, but the story's a little bit different, and I'm not going to go into that because it will spoil this book. So I loved them. If you're really into fantasy romance, I highly recommend them. They're like going around on TikTok right now, which is how I found them, and I'm really glad that I'm reading both of them because they were so great, and they will be making it my favorites of the year list. Oh, I missed one. Okay, let me back up really quickly. I read The Name of the Wind for my book club pick this month. This is a reread for me. I read this last year, I think in April, and I rated it 5 out of 5 stars, and it became one of my favorite books of all time. And then I reread it last month, and I ended up rating it a 4 out of 5. It didn't hold up the same way that I remember it being the first time. I think part of that was just because of the like slow nature of the story. I wasn't really in the mood for such a slow book. This is the story of Koth, and he is telling his story in 3 days to this chronicler. And so in the first book, it's the first day of his storytelling, and it's kind of the story of him as a child when he was first studying magic with his like family's traveling carnival. And then also as he grows up and he becomes homeless on the streets, and then eventually goes to this magical school and learns how to control his magic a little bit better. It's a long story, and it's told from a very unreliable narrator, and you get a lot of the backstory and culture from the world, but also like you get a lot of, like you kind of fall in love with Koth a little bit. He's a really interesting character, and you don't necessarily love him upon reread, but the first time I read this, I was just like, you go, buddy, you got this, you can do it, like let's go. I don't have anything else to say about this book. It's a favorite on BookTube, so if you haven't heard of it yet, go check it out now. Next up, I finally finished my reread of Words of Radiance. And what did I read this for? Oh, I read this for Book Pushed Off, and this is by Brandon Sanderson. This is the sequel to The Way of Kings. It's the second book in the Stormlight Archives. Stormlight Archives are really, really hard to talk about because there's such an epic world, but it's basically, the first book is about this war that is starting on the Shattered Plains, and it's all these different characters from all over the world as they are kind of coming together into this war area and figuring out that things aren't as they seem, and it seems that magic might be like reappearing in the world. A long time ago, there were these people called the Knights Radiant, and they had magic, but they betrayed mankind, and ever since then it's kind of been a taboo subject. Things aren't always as they seem, and our main character, I would argue, in the first book is Kaladin, and he is a slave, and he has been sold to the war camp as a bridge boy, so he helps carry the bridges across so that the soldiers can get across these shattered plains. Also following Shalon, as she and her family are, her father has just died and her family is kind of going bankrupt, so she goes off to study underneath the niece of the king. I can't remember right now how she's related to the king. Anyways, she goes off to study magic, and her plan is to steal some stuff from this woman, but kind of things go awry. We're also following Dalinar, who is the, oh my god, I gotta try to remember all these family trees. He's the brother of the king, but the king dies like in the very first chapter. It's like something you know right away. And so his son becomes the king, and Dalinar is trying to bring honor back to the people, but he's also like plagued with these dreams. And we're also following his 2 sons, Renarin and Adolin. And Renarin is like this like wise, ignored nerd, and Adolin is like a jock if you have ever met one, but like for war. And in this book, we start to follow them all a lot more. Kind of the main focus of Kaladin breaks away, and we get to follow a lot more of the other characters in depth. And it's just really great. The first time I actually rated it 4 stars, and the second time I rated it 5 stars, and then it made it on my favorites of all time list. So it's really funny that like these kind of switched for me. I hear a lot of people saying that this one is their favorite. I still think that The Way of Kings is my favorite because I just love what Brandon Sanderson does to Kaladin in The Way of Kings. It's awful, but this one was so good. Next up, I read Legacy of Steel, which is the sequel to Legacy of Ash, and that was my favorite book of last year. I really enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed this one, so I read this for a buddy read this month. Rated it 5 stars. I think that Matthew Ward has my heart. You're gonna see Legacy of Light, which is the 3rd book, in the pile that I'll show you later of books that I bought this month, but I really don't know if I'm gonna move on to it because I feel like this like resolved all of my questions and I don't have any more left open, and I'm kind of like, what's the point? Why possibly ruin my love for this series with another book? Anyways, Legacy of Ash is the story of this country on the brink of war, and we are following kind of the destruction of everything that happens after this woman called the Phoenix dies. So we're following her 2 children as they have been locked away in kind of this like sideline country that is owned by like a greater like powerhouse. We're also following some people who are like political and high leaders in the army of said powerhouse, and then we're following their enemies across like the great expanse as they're all about to fight each other. It has lots of really cool magic. Book 2 delves a lot more into the gods of this realm, and oh my god, it opened up the world so much more. So interesting. There were so many twists and turns. There were characters who were thought to be dead and were actually alive, and characters who were thought to be alive and actually dead, and it was insane. I loved it. So I recommend this series if you're really into like high epic fantasy. It reads a lot like more classic fantasy, but Matthew Ward is so diverse and has so many great characters. It's just a breath of fresh air. Next, I read Infinity Blade Awakens by Brandon Sanderson. This is like a really short novella that he wrote based off of a video game, and so you are following this man who his family all throughout time, whenever they reach a certain age, they are sent to fight the God King, and every single time they have failed. And so he is sent in the first chapter, he has returned from defeating the God King. Kind of the people don't know what to do with him because he wasn't supposed to actually do that. And so it's him kind of figuring out what he should do with his life now that he's accomplished his life purpose, but he's not allowed back in his town because they're a little bit scared of him. It was okay. I feel like because it was so short, I really didn't get attached to any of the characters, and I felt really confused by the world building and everything that was happening, which I realize now that if I had played the video game, I think all of those kind of questions would have been answered, but I just really wasn't into it, so I rated it 3 out of 5 stars because it wasn't like poorly written or anything. It just wasn't like super great for me. That's absolutely everything I have to say about that book. Oh my goodness, I only have 2 left. This is insane. So next I read Crescent City, also known as House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. I did actually tab it. All of my annotations were just on the page. I guess I didn't tab it technically. I annotated it, but all of my annotations are inside the book, not on the outside. So I do plan on going back in and adding the like actual tabs so I can find them more easily. This one shocked me. Put this on my list of most intimidating books that I'm scared to get to in the next year, and this is the first one that I've gotten to from that stack, and I genuinely felt like it was meh for 60% of this book, 80% of this book. We are following Bryce as her best, I don't even want to say that. The summary spoils a lot more than I'm willing to spoil about this book. Let's just say that something bad has happened to Bryce and her best friend, and the 2 of them are dealing with things, and then one day, years after that, because the first like 200 pages are in one timeline and then it switches to another timeline, which was super funky for me, Bryce teams up with this investigator who is a fallen angel to try and figure out this crime that is happening in the city, that seems related to something that happened to her the 2 years in the past. This is an urban contemporary fantasy where there's like fae and monsters and everything like that, but people have like cell phones and technology and all of that stuff. So this is the last Sarah J Maas full-length book that I needed to read. As of right now, I've read all of her books except for the novella that goes with ACOTAR, and I'm still on the fence about whether or not I'm actually going to read it, but we shall see, maybe one day. And this book, the last 200 pages of this book were a 5-star. So phenomenal, so good. I would reread those last 200 pages, and in fact, I think I might before the second one comes out in February, which I'm so mad that I have to wait until February to read it. Like, I don't know how you all have been doing this for so long, waiting for the next book to come out, and then it was supposed to come out like in August and she moved it out. I don't get it. I'm glad I waited because this is going to be hard to wait as much as I have to wait. I really enjoyed reading this, even though the first 600 pages, like I said, were super meh. I was just in love with the process of reading. Sarah J Maas is super easy to read. Her characters, while they are kind of assholey and alpha douchey, are just, you just want to keep going and you just want to know more about them. I definitely didn't like Bryce or our main like man dude in the book, Hunt, but I felt like a lot of the side characters were so interesting to me. I really liked Rune, who is Bryce's half brother. It was great. I was actually sitting and thinking about it recently, and I was like, now that I've read all of SJM's full-length novels, how would I kind of stack them? And what the hell is the second book called? It's covered up right now. A Court of Mist and Fury is my favorite SJM book that I have ever read. I also genuinely enjoyed Heir of Fire. I actually preferred Queen of Shadow the first time through, but upon reread, did not like it. And I also really, really love A Court of Silver Flames, but I think after those ones, I might like this one next. I definitely think that this book is more of a prequel, kind of building up the world and setting everything up for the later books to kind of knock it home, but there's gonna be 7 books in this series plus some novellas, so she's got some time. And you know what? When I look back on ACOTAR and Throne of Glass, both of them were kind of prologues to the rest of the series, so I think that's just kind of her style. I don't know if I mentioned, I ended up rating this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I read this as a buddy read. Okay, well, catching that up right now. I read The Name of the Wind for Randomize My TBR, and I read Legacy of Steel for Animal on the Cover. Apologies that I forgot to mention those. Name of the Wind was supposed to be my book club pick for July, but I didn't make it to it because July was a huge slump. And then I read The Kingdom of Liars for my book club pick in August. So once again, I genuinely enjoyed Kingdom of Liars. I felt like it was a really quick read. I felt like I was just being pushed through it. I felt, oh my god, did I tab almost every single book that I read this month? I tabbed Guild and Glint and Crescent City and Legacy of Steel and this book. That's a lot of tabbing that I did this month. Anyways, really enjoyed this book, but I definitely don't think that it was like the greatest book that I've ever read, or even like super fantastic, or even like super well written, to be honest. But the world was so unique and interesting, and the characters were really enjoyable to read about. And I think that if the author just focuses a little bit more on writing dialogue, that I could easily fall in love with his writing. Nick Martell, this is his debut novel, so I would pick up the sequel and I would read other things that he's written, and I am actually planning on doing just that. It's falling out of its dust jacket, so I'm gonna let that go and just hold this up now. So I ended up rating this book a 3 out of 5 stars because of everything that I just said. Let me now tell you what this book is about. I'm gonna set this down. Oh, hold up. There we go. Ignore the scrape. The Kingdom of Liars, we are following this man named Michael, and 10 years ago his father killed the prince in line for the throne, and so he was executed and his whole family was branded as traitors. And he is trying to prove that his father is actually innocent and was set up for the crime. Now, in this world, there are kind of 2 interesting things that are really unique systems that I haven't seen much before. One, there are 2 moons, and one of the moons has been like attacked, and it is slowly, pieces are falling to earth and causing disasters. Second, the magic system in this world is based on fabrications, and so every person who has magic has a different fabrication, and if you use your fabrication without being trained in it, you start to lose your memory over time. And so it's really a problem where people don't necessarily want to get trained, because if you want to get trained, you kind of have to go into the military in this world. People don't necessarily want to do that. If they start using their magic, or if they accidentally use their magic because they don't know how to control it, they start to lose their memories, and it's a problem. It was genuinely interesting. Like I said, I would highly recommend this book. I think you should check it out. This is what my bingo board looked like at the end of the month. So as you can see, I'm gonna be looking at it on my phone. I had 3 bingos down and 2 across, but I had no diagonal ones. So that is 5 bingos. So let's figure out how many books I bought this month. So the first book I bought this month was Little Heaven, and I already talked about this. Because I made it more than 30% through, it does count towards the bingo board. I didn't read it for a prompt, so technically that means I have 2 books that haven't gone towards prompts yet. If I am going to actually be counting those, let me know down below if you think those should count. I think they should, but I gotta figure out how I'm going to like track them where we can see it. That doesn't count against me for this month. Second, I bought Kingdom of Liars, but as I read it this month, that doesn't count towards bingos, and it's good to go. Next this month, I did buy Glint and Gleam. Now I have finished Glint, so that doesn't count. And I've only made it about 10% through Gleam, so that is going to count as the first book towards bingo. So I have 4 bingos left now. Next, I bought House of Earth and Blood. I thought I was gonna be reading a library copy, but they needed it back before I could finish the book, so I went out and got my own. But as I did buy it and finish it this month, it doesn't count towards bingo, which is super great because it's a thick boy. And then the final 2 books I bought, but don't go away yet because there's more books that came into me this month, was Savage Lands and The Sutherlands. Both of these are TikTok finds. Both of these are like fae, fantasy romance, new adult books that are supposed to have lots of smut, have been compared to ACOTAR, but basically everything on TikTok is compared to ACOTAR, so let's be real, that means nothing anymore. Those are the books I bought, but I was also gifted / some pre-orders came in this month. The first pre-order that came in was Nolan, which is by Michael J. Sullivan. You guys can't see it, but I do have a collection of his books down here, and this is the brand new book that is coming out in the fall this year for him, and I got the special collector's edition as part of his Kickstarter because I have supported him in the past. He invites me to all of his Kickstarters, and I was super excited to be reading this and to be getting my hands on this beautiful edition. Do I know what this story's about? No. Also, there's a signed bookmark in here, and there's no summary. My next pre-order that came in is Legacy of Light, and I've kind of already talked about this, so this was affected by another month's bingo, so I don't have to count it for anything now. And I've mentioned the other 2 books already towards this series and the fact that I'm not sure if I actually want to read it, but no matter what, I'm glad I have it. It's gonna go on the shelf. Oh my god, you can't see it, but it's behind me now down here. I have the other 2, and I have the first one in hardback and paperback, and the hardback is signed. And then finally, an author contacted me this month and asked if I was interested in receiving a physical arc of his book, and so I tried to sample online and it seemed really good, so I said yes, and it arrived, and I'm not counting that as a book that I bought, so it doesn't count against bingo. And that book is Song of Echoes by R.E. Palmer. Now I do believe this book comes out in September for the general public. I read some of it and I was really interested in it. It kind of seems like this land where magic is kind of coming back, but we are following these 2 main characters. One of them is like a farm boy who might have to turn warrior, and one is this like woman who is leading this group of people. I read the back multiple times and am still really confused. It was interesting, and I'm excited to be picking this up. So that's it. I have 3 books that are counting towards bingo. It's these 3 right here, which means that I have 2 bingos I get to roll over into the month of September, which will be really great because September is my birthday month, so that means I will most likely be buying some books. Let me know down below if you have a wrap up or what your month looked like in August. I want to talk to you about books. Next month there's going to be a surprise on my TBR. You know how I've been pushing off Words of Radiance for a while trying to finish it? I finished another book that I've been pushing off for a long time. So spoiler alert, I finished Malice. I don't remember how my outro goes, but until next time, I'll talk to you in the comments. Bye!